Last week, the U.S. Treasury made a highly unusual move. Without notifying its European allies, it sold euros specifically to prop up the Japanese yen. The United States hasn't intervened to support the yen since the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s. Stepping in like this reveals a quiet desperation driving American economic policy right now. The immediate cause of that anxiety comes down to a single deadline. This year alone, $9 trillion of U.S. government debt is maturing and coming due. That is roughly a quarter of the entire national debt. To understand how the bill got so high, we have to look back at the pandemic response. The government funded that massive emergency effort largely by selling one-year, short-term debt, taking advantage of borrowing rates that sat near a historic low of 1%. This loop illustrates the trap of short-term financing. Selling a one-year bond forces the Treasury to constantly borrow new money to pay off the old. Today, those bond yields have spiked to 4.6%, making this replacement debt incredibly expensive. Rolling over $9 trillion at high rates is a serious financial headache, but it's what happens next that poses a genuine threat to the system, because three distinct global macroeconomic pressures are now colliding all at once. The first pressure comes from abroad. Historically, foreign nations eagerly bought U.S. debt, but Japan, currently the largest foreign holder of U.S. treasuries, is seeing its own domestic bond yields rise. That erodes the incentive for Japanese investors to buy American debt, encouraging them to keep their capital at home. China is executing its own financial pivot. Instead of stockpiling American debt, Beijing is steadily substituting its U.S. Treasury holdings with physical gold reserves. At the same time, the long-standing petrodollar arrangement is fracturing. Regional conflicts are forcing Gulf states to tighten their domestic budgets, meaning they are no longer automatically recycling their oil profits into U.S. bonds. For decades, the United States could rely on foreign buyers to eagerly absorb its debt. That reliable safety net is now quietly evaporating. The second pressure is building domestically. Even with a booming stock market, the broader U.S. economy is showing distinct signs of slowing down. Employment growth is dropping, labor market participation is declining, and consumer sentiment reached record lows. This chart shows the mechanical reality of an economic slowdown. When a recession hits, tax revenues naturally fall while social safety net costs go up. Historically, this combination surges the federal deficit by 20 to 33%. A cooling economy guarantees the U.S. government will be forced to borrow substantially more money, and it must do so precisely when the cost to borrow that money is astronomically high. The third and most permanent pressure is demographic. The United States has an aging population. This structural shift creates a dual economic bind. It guarantees a massive, mandatory explosion in pension and healthcare spending, while simultaneously leaving a rapidly shrinking workforce to generate the tax revenue to pay for it. This line chart tracks the historical and projected U.S. debt to GDP ratio. According to the Congressional Budget Office, without the political will to aggressively raise taxes or cut spending, U.S. debt is structurally hardwired to reach 175% of GDP. Interest rates fluctuate, and recessions eventually end, but demographic aging is a permanent mathematical reality, one that short-term financial tricks simply cannot outrun. These three converging pressures, geopolitical retreat, economic slowdown, and demographic aging, are culminating in the slow, agonizing suffocation of the federal budget. To quantify that squeeze, consider this financial block representing the government's baseline interest payments in 2020, which sat at $521 billion. Today, that annual cost has more than doubled to $1.18 trillion, and the near-future trajectory is severe. Current projections show annual interest payments rocketing to $2.1 trillion by 2036. At that level, servicing the debt will consume 19% of the entire federal budget. That single expense will easily dwarf what the country spends on vital pillars like health and defense. The stark reality is a zero-sum game. Every single tax dollar used to service this compounding interest is a dollar permanently diverted from the nation's infrastructure and future economic growth. To avoid the incredibly unpopular move of raising taxes, the government is leaning on a final institutional lever. The Federal Reserve is quietly stepping back into the market, effectively creating money to buy the Treasury's debt. This process is often called stealth quantitative easing. While it technically prevents a government default by ensuring there is always a buyer for U.S. bonds, it actively dilutes the value of the currency itself. The United States government will not go bankrupt, rolling over $9 trillion this year, but the bill still has to be paid. Ultimately, the American public will bear the cost of this financial trap through the invisible, inescapable tax of persistent, long-term inflation.